Great. So we are straight onto our next lecture, and we've got Professor Jack from UC Berkeley, who I think in the program is going to talk to us about cities and the environment, but actually you're going to get a lot more on service delivery. So over to Prof. Jack.
Great. I tend to get a little bit excited, so if it gets too loud, just give me a wave. Okay, wonderful. So yes, the program says cities and the environment. I want to talk to you about service delivery, so very much picking up on kind of where Matt ended, which is thinking about we build the infrastructure, and then the question, of course, is can the infrastructure continue to be used? You know, you build the sewer network, but it's costly to run it, it's costly to maintain it, so it's fine to put the infrastructure in place, but that's not all there is to it. But I actually want to motivate this with some kind of thoughts about the environment and environmental quality. All right, very good. So, if we think about urbanization, which is what you're here to think about, and we kind of think about an environmental perspective of what are some pros, what are some cons. We're all economists, so we should start with the cons, right? We're the dismal science after all. We have to live up to our reputation. So a few of them, if we're really interested in the environment, are things like pollution, right? So you concentrate a lot of people, you concentrate a lot of economic activity. These are, of course, the things that make cities wonderful, but they also are things that generate externalities, right? They generate environmental externalities. When we think about local public goods, things like local air quality, and we want to think about adding up all of the damages, all of the costs of poor local air quality, for example, what matters when we do this are sort of two things. The first is, what is the concentration? How much particulate matter is floating around in the air, right? That's how dirty is the air outside when you breathe it. But then to calculate damages, we also need to know how many people are breathing that dirty air, right? So damages are just the combination of ambient environmental quality and exposure. Exposure here, damages are going to be exposure times the number of people who are being exposed. So anybody who's taken a public economics class or an environmental economics class, this is probably, quite familiar. So what are cities doing? They're making that N really big, right? So if you have a coal-fired power plant out in the middle of nowhere and it's producing a lot of emissions and nobody's breathing in that bad air quality, the damages are quite small, even for the same ambient air quality, even for the same kind of, bad stuff in the air. Put a lot of people next to that coal-fired power plant, and suddenly the damages are very large. And so why is this important for cities? This is important for cities because they're concentrating people. And so a smaller change in some bad environmental amenity is getting multiplied through by many more people, leading to just many more damages, okay? Now, if we want to think about exposure, it's also going to be important to think about, I'm calling this self-protection here, but it's like whatever wedge is there that minimizes the impact of some bad environmental quality that's out there and how it's actually affecting people, okay? And this is important if you think about what Matt was just talking about with sewers. What is, one of the great virtues of sewers is they're helping protect people from bad environmental quality, in this case, typically water quality. Okay, so that's on the con side. We'll come back to the pros side. Let's just see a little bit more kind of motivating evidence. First, let me get a little bit of a read of kind of the room. How many of you have taken an environmental economics class at some point? Anyone? Oops, sorry about that. Okay, a couple people. Public economics? A little bit more? Okay, very good. Okay, so if I'm using any terms related to, things like ambient environmental quality, does that make sense to people? What does that mean? Anybody want to give a go? What do I mean by ambient environmental quality? Any guesses? Even if you've never taken an environmental economics class, you can probably guess what it means.
guessing it's just a standard environmental quality.
Yeah.
Its natural state.
It's what's out there, right? So the ambient is just like out in the environment, and the air quality is the air quality. The environmental quality is the environmental quality. So it's just kind of it's what's out there. It's what, you know, you step outside and you are exposed to the ambient environmental air quality, okay? So this is before you put on a mask, before you go inside and turn on your air filter, before any of those other things happen. But it's potentially conditional on whatever regulatory environment you're in. And so a regulation that limits pollution will change ambient environmental quality, okay? This isn't gonna be hugely important in what we go through, but it's worth knowing some of that terminology. All right, so we'll come back to the kind of pros of urbanization, but you can kind of start to see some of the cons of urbanization for damages from a dirty environment, right? It's basically this it's basically that you're concentrating people, you're potentially increasing the amount of environmental damages that are out there because economic activity is polluting, but really importantly, you're just increasing the number of people who are getting exposed if the environment is actually dirty. All right, so we see some evidence of this, and so we're gonna think about environment quite broadly. We're gonna think about both pollution, but also kind of other environmental threats. So related to what Matt was talking about, diseases that are potentially waterborne, other things like that. So that's a form of pollution. I'll talk in the end a bit about climate change, okay? And we'll talk about sort of environmental shocks as well, but you could think about extreme heat as also a type of environmental quality. Okay, very good. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay, so just to kind of motivate that this is in fact relevant for thinking about urban settings. The first thing here is we can look at air quality. I'm going to kind of jump around across environmental problems a little bit here, but one thing about air quality is that urban populations are just emitting a lot of pollution. This is coming from public transportation, this is coming from industry, this is coming from any number of other things, including things like construction. What's also important is that in low-income settings in particular, it's not only that people are getting exposed to these environmental hazards outside of their home, it's also that they're potentially getting exposed to these environmental hazards inside of their home if they're cooking with dirty fuels, if their quality of home construction is not able to filter out particulate matter, other things like that, means that they're getting extra exposure also inside of the home. So in this recent paper, there's a figure from a different paper, but this recent paper found that in 65% of a sample of metropolitan areas, the air pollution, so particulate matter, right, that's just the bits of pollution that are floating around in the air, that the concentrations were higher in this urban environment than the corresponding national average. So again, it's not only in some cases that the number of people getting exposed is higher in the urban areas, but the quality of the air may actually be worse in these places. Another thing, and we're going to come back to this later in the session today, is thinking about water scarcity. So this is an increasingly high-profile concern in urban settings. And here the problem's a little bit different. It's that there's a finite resource, which is the amount of available water, and you concentrate more people in one place and try to draw upon that resource, and that resource becomes more scarce. Okay, so estimates are that about 1 billion people around the world are facing urban water scarcity, and that this number is growing both because there's more people moving to urban areas and the population is growing in these urban areas, but also because climate change is just lowering supply on average, but also making it more variable. And this is a really hard challenge for urban water utilities to manage, is this variability in supply. So we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail as well. Okay, so this is sort of motivation. This is meant to say that these kinds of environmental challenges are potentially very relevant for somebody interested in urban economics, right? It's sort of, why are we talking about this? Well, these are in fact urban problems in a lot of ways. And so then let's return to this question of then, well, so what? What can cities do about this? How is this potentially managed in an urban environment? And this is where the pros part of this slide kicks in. The main thing here is that there are economies of scale in managing pollution. There are economies of scale in managing a lot of these kinds of environmental challenges. This can look like regulation. If you're just trying to say, all right, firms and factories, there's a limit on how much you can pollute. If those firms and factories are concentrated geographically, then the costs of monitoring them are potentially lower. The costs of enforcement are potentially lower. There are these kinds of economies of scale. In addition, and this is really where we're going to go in the rest of the lecture today, let's see, can I point here, is that service delivery. If we think about service delivery, so what comes to mind when I say service delivery? What do you think I'm talking about? What kinds of services come to mind in an urban setting? Water, good. What else? Electricity, excellent. Anything else? Waste, perfect. Other things? Health, yeah. Other things? Parks, great. Anything else? Infrastructure? Transport infrastructure, very good. So public transportation, so the infrastructure, but also the services, right? And so what you just said actually hits on a really important thing. It's because there's an infrastructure piece, this kind of like fixed cost of building out these services, whether it's health clinics, whether it's roads, whether it's the waste treatment plants, whatever it is. But then you also have to operate them, right? You also have to keep them functional. You have to put buses on the roads. You have to make sure the buses are maintained. You have to make sure they're running on time. You have to get the water into the pipes after you build the pipes. It's not enough to just build the pipes, right? And so the service delivery part is that like operations and management side of this. So Matt was talking a lot about the infrastructure part. We build the stuff. This is talking about we make it work, okay? So why is this important for the environment? All the things that you just named, I think all of them, maybe somebody said something that doesn't match this, but water, electricity, waste, transportation, health, all of these things on some level, not everything they do, but on some level, are helping to drive a wedge between this ambient environmental quality, what the environmental quality would be without these public services, and what the individual resident in the city actually ends up experiencing, okay? So this is gonna work if you think about electricity, for example. People are able to cook with cleaner fuels. They're able to basically be inside more. It's going to lower the amount. Actually, sorry. It's going to do two things. It's going to drive this wedge, but it's also going to just improve ambient environmental quality, right? So electricity is going to be cleaner than cooking with charcoal, than cooking with dirtier fuels. If we think about water. If their water is being treated, whatever water quality is out there, the city is going to treat it, ideally put it through the pipes, and the water that the individual consumes is cleaner than the water if they were getting it directly, right? And so there are these economies of scale in service delivery as well. If you all have maybe studied this in your urban economics classes, but the difference between, for example, the cost of water supply in rural areas per capita and the cost of water supply in urban areas per capita, it is much lower in urban areas just because that same kilometer of pipes can be spread across many, many more people in terms of the cost per person, okay? Lowering the cost per person. Okay, great. So you kind of see this logic starting to come through, like, yes, on the one hand, urban centers can be challenging from an environmental perspective. They're the source of a lot of pollution. A lot of people are being exposed simultaneously. But the solutions to manage these types of problems can also more efficiently be supplied in urban areas. So we're going to talk more about service delivery, but let's just think first through this a little bit more. This is just summarizing what we just talked through. One thing I will say, I'll talk a little bit about electricity, but it's important to note that electricity, sometimes we think of it as an urban service, but sometimes the municipal government does not have much to do with electricity supply. So when we're thinking about kind of urban service delivery, Electricity is a good example because there's lots of research that's been done on it. It's a good thing to, be thinking about and studying, but it's not always something that the kind of municipal government has much control over. Okay, good. Questions on this list here of things that are sort of potentially in scope, or anything you want to add to it?
Like, for instance, in Asian countries, their water is not safe to drink
Yeah.
or consume. They drink
Good.
water and also use shower filters.
Okay, perfect. So you're asking about bottled water and sort of private alternatives. So one way to think about the bottled water is, so water may still be going through the pipes. If that water is low quality, then there may be public water supply, but people will go find some private alternative water supply, like bottled water. Some of you may have, read about water trucks that deliver water in certain neighborhoods because the public water supply is either unpredictable, right? Sometimes it just doesn't flow, or of low quality, right? So you can think of those as private substitutes for publicly provided services, okay? And so it also may be that in some settings, there is no piped water supply. But in the examples that you're bringing up, this would be a private alternative because the quality, for example, is not high enough. The private alternative is higher quality. And actually, the kind of case that I'm going to present at the end is one where this exact issue is going to come up, is how much are citizens substituting towards some private alternative for low-quality public supply. And this is going to be fundamentally kind of the motivating thing, is this is the promise, but often that promise is not realized. So often, we would very much like all of these things to be working. We would very much like, all of these services to be delivered in a reliable and high quality way. I'm sure everyone's experience is that is often just not the case, right? Yeah.
The same for public transportation. Because in South
Yeah.
Africa, we use fossil fuel-based vehicles, right?
Perfect.
And then when fossil fuels burn, they release strong greenhouse gases. So would you also like share the same sentiments? Because when you look at public transport, right, it has benefits, but it also has like cons, right?
Sure.
So it's good for per capita, the number of people that can ride in the public transport, but also bad because we're using outdated vehicles.
Yeah, so it's a similar thing. So I think I want you to think about this not just as a binary thing of is there public transportation or not, but also how high quality is that public transportation. And that can be on a lot of different metrics. That can be, is it reliable? Is it available? Is it high quality? But it could be, is it clean? Right? It could be anything like that. So the question, to kind of come back to your question about substitution between the private solution and the public solution, the private solution in this case might be taking a car, taking a motorbike, or walking, right? If the substitution is between walking and public transportation, you might think that the pollution per user is going up because walking is cleaner, but probably welfare is also going up because now this person doesn't have to spend as much of their time walking. But it's going to be, there's sort of many facets to this, but I think that these all have kind of different things embedded in them. But in all cases, there's some component of these types of investments, these types of public investments have the promise of making damages from low environmental quality less in urban settings. That's kind of the commonality across them.
But at the same time, when you look at developing countries, when you look at investment, we have like high upfront costs, so we can't really, invest.
Perfect. We're getting there. We're going to talk about all of that. That's great. So you're anticipating exactly what I want to spend more time on. Let me just finish motivating this just to say that I'm not just asserting these things. If we look in the data, it is also true. So far more people in urban areas have access to sanitation services. Far more people in urban areas have access to safe drinking water. Again, this is access. It's not necessarily saying it's always delivered, it's always clean, et cetera. But these kind of course access metrics. Access to electricity, the same story. So rural is on the horizontal axis, urban is on the vertical axis. Everything is above the 45-degree line here. Way more electricity access in urban areas. And all of this can come back to this sort of basic point of it is cheaper per capita to provide these kinds of things if there are just a lot of people concentrated around the infrastructure, okay? All right, so nothing particularly magic happening here. Then the question is, what do we know about whether this actually matters? Whether, to your questions, having public transportation, for example, actually does lead to improved air quality. This is actually a picture from a paper that I think Matt has left the room. That's great because I'm presenting a figure from one of his papers, which is always dangerous to do when the person's in the audience. But this is a paper that tries to look around the world at the opening of subways in different urban centers and what the impact is on air pollution using satellite data measuring air quality around the opening of these subway stations. And what they find is it's a little bit of a subtle picture. It doesn't sort of like fall out of the data into your lap, but among places that had high baseline pollution, on average, there is a small decrease in air pollution. As you're pointing out, it's a bit all over the place, and part of the reason it's a bit all over the place is because when subway lines are opening, often you're in fast-growing cities, and so there are lots of other reasons that things are, increasing and changing, and they have all sorts of econometrics in here to try to deal with that. I'm not going to get into all of those today, just to say that the individual data points are all over the place. The average is a slight reduction, okay? Okay, good. So some indication that these kinds of public investments in urban centers, in public services, can improve environmental quality. But then we can look at another paper, and I don't know if Matt mentioned this one, but this is an older paper in Argentina across different municipal settings, looking at water services and sewer services. And what they find in this case is actually going from public supply to private supply, privatizing water supply in these municipalities actually had big impacts on water quality and health. So that suggests that actually maybe what was being publicly provided just wasn't all that great. And when the private sector stepped in, it actually improved. And so this starts to raise some of these questions about the quality of public services really mattering, that just the existence of that sewer network is not enough. The existence of that piped water supply is not enough. It has to be well-run, high quality, and so on. So this is what I want to talk to you about for the rest of our time. Does that sound right? Okay. So the argument, again, is basically that if we are interested in improving environmental conditions in urban settings, getting service delivery right is sort of a first order challenge for doing that. Okay, good. So that's that point. So there are a bunch of challenges to realizing this potential. Okay, so all of those first kind of motivating things were to say there is promise here. Now let's talk about all the reasons why that promise is not actually being realized. So we want to talk about efficiency, we want to talk about equity and affordability, and talk a little bit about kind of uncertainty. Think about this kind of variable supply problem, right? The focus is going to be on service delivery. I'm going to talk a lot about water. Okay, so Matt was talking about sewer. You can think of that as like the outputs. I'm going to talk about water. That's the inputs. Okay, but also a few examples from electricity as well. That was a joke. Nobody laughed at my joke. All right. Okay, so for the rest of the time, we're going to do a little bit of an overview of each of these, and then I'm going to end with a case study from right here, from Cape Town, South Africa, thinking about water. All right. You can probably anticipate what it's about. Good. Any questions, comments so far before we get into more of this on service delivery? All right, great. So that was your cities and the environment piece of this. Now we're really going to talk about the service delivery part. Okay, so when we think about, oh, this is funny. This display isn't advancing anymore. I don't know if anybody, I think it's okay. It just means I'm going to be looking behind me a little bit more. Sorry about that. Okay, so if we think about the typical way that these types of public services are provided, it's as they form natural monopolies. So why is that? Anybody want to talk about why it would be that these are mostly run? So you can think about waters, you can think about sewers, you can think about electricity. Why are these mostly run as public utilities, as natural monopolies?
Because the cost of having competition is too high. So think of the sewer, for instance. Laying competitive sewers across the city will be a nightmare, both cost and...
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because of this infrastructure piece, right? Because such a large share of the problem is this like initial fixed capital investment, right? It's building the pipes, it's building the seawall, it's building these big things. And then the operating piece, like the Argentina example is actually a good one of, you know, maybe sometimes you could have some private actors step in and do some of the management piece of it. But typically what we end up seeing is that these are monopolies, right? And on some level, that's incredibly powerful and incredibly good because otherwise these things would not exist, right? You have to have some way of being able to recoup these initial investment costs, but it's going to give rise to a bunch of thorny issues around kind of distortions around pricing, around inefficient operations, around lack of investment in continued upgrades. So typically we should think about these as sort of these service delivery models, right? So if you're in a city, maybe there's a sewer system because you're on the right side of the drainage basin, and in that case, what happens? Well, you consume, let's not keep with that example. So you're getting water supplied into your house, you consume the water, all right? Over the course of a month, typically, at the end of the month, you get a bill. Sometimes you pay that bill. We'll talk about non-bill payment, all right? Sometimes you pay that bill. Prices are being set by this monopolist to cover both fixed and variable costs, okay? So the fixed costs come in two flavors. One are these capital investment costs, which are sunk, all right? But they're still getting paid for somehow, okay? And the second piece are the fixed costs of just being in electricity land. They call it kilowatt hour ready. Even if you as a household don't consume any electricity at all, there is a fixed cost to making sure that the grid is ready to supply you at any given moment should you turn on the lights. The same is going to be true for the water supply. The same is going to be true for the sewer system. There's just a fixed cost of being a customer on the grid, regardless of your consumption, all right? Then there's a variable cost. In water, that is incredibly small relative to these fixed costs. The cost of providing a liter of water to a household is very, very small. Even the cost of providing a kilowatt hour relative to a lot of these fixed costs is not huge. It's not as big of a differential as in water. So we think about the solution there as being a two-part tariff, right? Does that sound familiar to some of you? Maybe. Where we want to charge separately for the fixed costs and the variable costs, right? So what that would look like is each month you pay something irrespective of how much you consume that covers the fixed costs of being ready to supply your household, and then you pay per unit of what you actually consume, all right? Now, if you live in Cape Town, how many of you live here? Has this come up recently? So say a teeny bit about anybody, a teeny bit about how it's come up recently.
Well, in the context of post-drought Cape Town, there's been a lot of households that moved to off-grid water supply, which has meant that fewer customers for the city's water. And so in order to kind of capture that piece around being water ready, as it were, the city is moving towards the fixed cost charge and a volumetric supply rather than just based on your usage, because a lot of people have no water payments. Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing about all of this is that people really don't want this, right? So people are pissed about this. And it's been a big kerfuffle about the new tariffs coming out and all sorts of stuff. When from an economic efficiency standpoint, it's a total no-brainer. Right? We absolutely should be charging people separately for the fixed costs and the variable costs. Now, why is that? It's because if you do what a lot of water utilities do, and what Cape Town has done to some extent, historically, completely, to some extent recently, and put these fixed charges into the variable cost, into the variable charge, into the per kiloliter price of water, what does that do to the per kiloliter price of water? It goes up. What does that do to consumption? It goes down. So consumption gets distorted away from the efficient level, which is just going to be consuming
at a price equal to marginal cost, right? You're going to end up with less consumption. Yes, that consumption will be covering both the fixed costs and the variable costs, but it'll be distorted downward, which is bad for consumer surplus, which is bad for ultimate revenue recovery. Okay, so good. That in practice, this is what's happening. Now, there's some major challenges that go above and beyond this. So this piece of pricing distortions, putting the fixed costs into the variable charge, that's going to be an example of a pricing distortion, but there are lots of others. We're going to talk about subsidies as well, and where subsidies show up and what are some of the costs of those subsidies. But let's start with this first one, which comes up a lot. So in places where you're from, how much of a problem is unpaid bills, non-payment of bills? Has anybody worked on this or looked at this or have any idea?
Thank you. I'm currently working on a project with, I'm doing my doctorate in economics looking at smart cities. So I'm currently working on a project with my supervisor instructed by the Water Research Commission, of which is a Water Act in South Africa, to nudge the consumers to pay, because there's a whole lot of municipality can't do some of their activities because people are not paying. So in that project, we're trying to find out what are some of the nudges that are there to encourage people to pay for the services. And what we're finding out now is that the poorest of the poor in South Africa are the one that, yes, they use minimum water, but they can't pay because most of them, we find that they rely on the social release grant, which is like, less, I don't know, it's very little in dollars. For their daily life.
Good.
So that's the other issue as well.
Good.
And we find that most is paid by the middle income class and high income classes.
Okay, great. So you're bringing up something that we're going to talk a little bit about, which is when we see people not paying their bills, understanding why it is that they're not paying their bills is really important for thinking about what solutions do you want to design. You're describing a setting where it's the lowest income people who are not paying their bills. In other settings, that's not always the case, right? In other settings, sometimes it's actually quite high users, potentially who are politically connected, for example, who are the ones who just never pay their bills. So in some cases, it will be an ability to pay story, but in other cases, it's a little more, a little more political economy maybe floating in there. Okay, so what happens when somebody doesn't pay their bill? So remember this model, right? You're consuming water. It's being recorded, the amount you consume is being recorded on your water meter. Somebody comes around, reads your meter, and you get a bill. And then maybe you pay your bill, maybe you don't. What happens if you don't pay your bill?
They do not get the water service.
Sometimes. Sorry? Do they get it?
For example, you don't pay,
Yeah.
cut the service.
Where are you from?
I'm from Ethiopia.
Okay, and they automatically cut it.
Yeah. When you don't pay the payment, the company will come and they interrupt the service.
Okay.
That is the case from Bahadar, Ethiopia.
Okay, so in your setting, that is true.
Yeah.
Okay. Others? They do cut the electricity. Is that what you're saying? Yes. No. Okay. You're saying no.
In South Africa. In South Africa, no.
Yeah.
There is the biggest township in South Africa, which is Soweto. We have found out in the previous years that they had not been paying for their electricity for more than 10 years.
Yeah.
And when the government tried to redress that, it was a whole violence protest thing. So it's not always the case. In some areas of South Africa, yes, it works. But if it's a large township like that, it causes violence.
Yeah. So it's pretty heterogeneous, okay? In some cases, enforcement is strong. In other cases, it's extremely lax. The typical case is somewhere in the middle of year two. It's not 10 years of non-payment versus immediate disconnection. It's somewhere in the middle. And that's for a few reasons. There was yes?
Yes, so in South Africa, it's actually unlawful for the municipality to cut off water.
Yeah, so yes.
Because Section 24 of the Constitution safeguards the access to water. So what municipalities can do is to restrict the pressure.
Yeah.
So instead of cutting it off outrightly.
Yeah, so that's right. So in South Africa, water is special, right? Water cannot be, and so yeah, the water, drink it. It's very special, and there's plenty of it right now here, by the way, for the record. Not always, but so water cannot be disconnected, and so part of what you find here is these water management devices which restrict flow or cap the amount that a household gets to a certain amount per day, right? So that's one type of solution. In a lot of settings, though, there are a few different things. So one is that you'll find a certain amount of leniency, right? Maybe it's not 10 years, but maybe it's not, maybe it's not as soon as you fall into arrears. It's a year, it's 3 months, it's, some amount of time. And part of that is because it is not cheap to go in and disconnect a household and then reconnect a household. And so that household have to have enough debts and a high enough probability that you're going to get some of those debts repaid to make it worth it from the utility standpoint, just from a pure cost-benefit standpoint, to say it's worth it to go in and do that disconnection. Add on top of that the potential for violence, add on top of that, all of the politics and the optics of are you going in and disconnecting low-income households. There are a lot of different reasons that it's actually fairly rare to see very perfect enforcement. Yes.
Municipality is kind of encouraging people to pay for water. What they do, they install prepaid water boxes for both middle, low, and high income, so that people should start paying for bills. I think probably if you buy water of 100 rand, it's close to 2,000 liters. So the municipalities are adopting to put prepaid water boxes for people to pay for services.
Great.
Which is a good idea.
Where is this?
In Mangaung, Bloemfontein.
Okay, great. And so how many of you have a prepaid electricity meter? Okay, so yes, prepaid water meters are a thing. It turns out they are not as good as prepaid electricity meters precisely because there's a mechanical component to them. You have to stop the flow of water, and that thing breaks. So with electricity, it's much easier because you just have to interrupt the current. So prepaid water meters have been around for a while, and they solve this kind of payment problem exactly as you're describing, but they break. And so the places that have tried them out, they can help on the one hand, but then you have to replace them. You have to send out the maintenance guy. They're a little bit glitchier than the prepaid electricity meters. Okay. What happens in the setting with kind of medium enforcement, maybe not no enforcement at all, but certainly not perfect enforcement, when somebody doesn't pay their water bill, when the customer perceives this kind of lax enforcement? Something happens to that customer, and then something happens to all the other customers when one customer is thinking about not paying. Does somebody want to go through this? So what is the own customer who's thinking about should I pay or not? How are they thinking about their water use? They're realizing that I could pay some of the time, I could partially pay. What does that do to their water use? Yeah.
I think it depends.
Okay.
Thank you. I think it depends where do you stay.
Sure.
For example, I stay in the urban area. You have to pay your municipality. But if it's in the rural or the township, there isn't much that can be done. So what we see is that most of the people from the township, they are, how do you say it in English, backpacking on our backs because we end up even paying for them. And even when I was discussing the water, the day zero thing with a colleague from City of Cape Town, because I was asking them how did they do it, and she said that what they saw is that mostly the people who were not paying were the higher class, the wealthy, because those who stayed in the township, they use a small basin to bath. So also I think it depends where.
Yeah. So let's just do the cartoon version of it. This is what we love to do in economics, right? Like ignore the subtleties and just talk about sort of the kind of big, broad brushstrokes. So some individual is in a setting where they're somewhat slack enforcement, right? They know that they can pay, but they don't really have to pay everything. So what that does to their own perceived price of water, right, is it falls. Because you don't have to pay for every liter that you use. And so, this is telling me I'm going too slowly. So it feels like water's cheaper precisely because you don't have to pay for every unit that you use, right? So you're maybe gonna use a little bit more. But, so this is gonna lower this kind of experience price for the non-payer. But it's also gonna create an externality in the network, right? This is gonna create an externality on other users. How is it gonna do that? Well, in a few different ways, okay? So if the water utility, maybe it's a municipal utility, is now getting less revenue because some people are not paying their bills, what can that utility do? Well, it still needs revenue to cover costs, right? So it could increase tariffs in the hope that you've still got some people paying. Now they're gonna pay a little bit more. That can cover the cost of both that user who's a good payer and those non-payers, right? So that's a pecuniary externality that's gonna show up in prices. What else could they do? So they could try to increase revenue by increasing tariffs for all the payers. What else could they do?
They may get loan from other institutions.
Okay, so they could get a loan. If you're not getting great bill payment, it may be harder and harder to get a loan, but okay, maybe they get some other source of financing. It's possible. What else could they do? They could ration, perfect. So you can change quantities. That's lowering cost potentially. They could also just lower service quality. So rationing is one version of that, but they could do other things. They could not invest in as much in the pipes. Is that what you're gonna say?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So they could, they could do less to keep quality high. And so maybe that's rationing, that's like an immediate thing, but often it's gonna be this like slow deterioration, right? You're not recovering all of the costs that you've billed. So what do? You try to lower your costs. How do you do that? You skimp on maintenance. You skip on investments in quality, right? Okay, so this is a paper that I'm going to talk about in a couple of times in the next few slides. This is Elizabeth Spink's job market paper. This is working with a water utility in Zambia. And so she documented exactly this problem of a large share of customers, or a decent share of customers, were not paying their bills in full or on time. And so what she shows is that the effective price ends up being actually below marginal costs. And so here she means effective price being like the enforcement probability times the price that was being charged. If the enforcement probability is less than 1, then the experienced price is going to be less than the price that you're being charged, right? So that experienced price is below marginal cost, but then the average price, which is what they're actually ending up billing because they're trying to recover some of these fixed costs, is actually going up. So they're trying to recover these costs, sorry, not the fixed costs, the non-payment costs. So they're ending up charging above marginal cost to everybody else precisely because of these people who are not paying their bills. Okay, so this creates a further distortion. That's going to lower consumption even among the good bill payer types. It's going to increase consumption among the bad bill payer types because they feel like they have a lower price, right? And so you're going to get exactly this kind of thing going in the wrong direction. Okay, so this is one of many reasons that cost recovery may be incomplete. So in writing up this paper, she talked about utilities as creditors. Right? So if you don't have to pay your bill right on time, we might think, and this might be true in particular if the non-bill payers are all the very low income households, we might think this is just a transfer. This is fine, right? It's just a transfer from the utility to the household in the form of cheap credit, right? Maybe as your bill gets older, you have to start to pay some interest on it, but it's typically going to be lower than whatever you would get on the private market. So it's still kind of a subsidy for these households, okay? But because of these externalities that we were talking about, because tariffs may have to go up in response to this, because infrastructure quality may fall, because rationing may kick in, it's not quite that simple. Yes, it's a transfer to those who voluntarily choose not to pay their bills on time, but it's one with repercussions for everybody in the network and for future users as well. Okay, but this raises this question of, first of all, who are these people who are not paying their bills? And why are they doing it? Is it because they're low income and they actually can't afford these prices? Or is it because they're just taking advantage of some slackness in the system? Okay, so I'm going to show you what Spink found in her paper in just a minute, but I'll point out that there's an experiment in Nairobi that tries to test exactly sort of two different theories for why is it that households maybe are not paying their bills on time and in full. So this Koval et al. Paper, they worked with the utility company in Nairobi to do two different treatments. So this was a randomized controlled trial. One treatment was about sort of a tax morale or payment morale type of a thing, that maybe you just don't feel like your utility is there for you, so you're not going to be there for your utility either. So how many of you have heard the phrase tax morale? This comes up in public economics a lot. It's this idea that you have this like fiscal contract with the state. If the state provides public goods, then you will pay your taxes. But as soon as that kind of falls apart, the state's not doing their part, then citizens are no longer willing to pay taxes. You can think of bills in a context where enforcement is not very strong. Why are some people paying their bills if there's no real probability that they're going to get disconnected? Same kind of an idea. It's that this service is being provided to you. It is your obligation as a citizen to go ahead and pay for it. Okay? So that's what they were trying to get at in this first treatment. They increased contact from members of the utility. They tried to make the utility seem like it was there for you. They had employees of the utility contacting households and saying like, Nairobi Water's here for you. What do you need from us, kind of thing. I don't know exactly what their messaging was. But then they contrasted that with the Ethiopia intervention of if you didn't pay your bills, they just went in and disconnected you. Okay, so they wanted to test, is it actually that this weak enforcement is just creating this opportunity for people, and people are being opportunistic, right? So they wanted to see, would that be more effective, or could you actually use this much lighter touch, softer thing of just trying to boost morale and get people to actually pay? The findings are up here. Is this surprising? I should have hidden the findings and gotten you guys to vote on them, but is this surprising to you? Had anybody heard of this paper before? It was pretty controversial when it came out. Why do you think it was? Yeah.
It's not related to this, but it's related to what was done in Nairobi, Kibera, where like you're saying that some people are not paying, and then so there is that misuse, let's say misuse. But then you find that neighbors and people within the same area also just see if so-and-so is not paying and they're getting away with it. So you find like a whole block, people are not paying. And then the utility cannot get resources. So what they just do, because they say that those people are difficult to deal with, they just disconnect the water.
For the whole area?
Yes. Okay. And then now the political issues, they negotiate and come up with a way. Sometimes government gives grants and says, you need to provide them with water for like this amount of time. Then from this month, they start to pay. So
good. There was another,
I would think it was controversial because maybe people would assume that if you're not paying, you can't pay. And this kind of shows that there is some choice.
So that was a big part of the concern. Were you going to say something similar?
I'm interested in the nature of the engagement. I think that matters a lot. Then related to that is the tariff payment culture around. So suppose she's my neighbor, she's not paying, and we go to, in Ghana context, we go to the same church. So yeah, I'll not feel bad if she gets to know that I don't pay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So the paying capture, I think, can be something interesting, and maybe information treatments around that could also. So let's not. After the enforcement, I am encouraged. I wish it's even more than the 50%.
Yeah.
Because, as you said, there is cost involved.
Yeah.
So if it's going to cost that much to enforce,
Yeah.
and the return is 4%,
Yeah.
you may not need to
Yeah.
enforce.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so that's exactly right. So, one thing that we can see, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I'm from Pretoria, so it's a metropolitan city. So in the city of Tshwane, when you don't, in the urban areas, when you don't pay for your water, you the moment you buy your prepaid electricity, they take some of, whether you like it or not, that's how they catch us. So you end up paying for the outstanding amount. But I don't think the same is applied in the township, which is unfair. And it goes back to what my colleague was saying, that some people in the township, they take unfair advantage, and then those of us who are in the urban areas, we have to pay for them.
Yeah, good. And so some of what you all are bringing up is this really important thing as well of, nobody wants to be the sucker, right? Like, you don't want to be the person who's paying for somebody else's bad behavior, right? You don't want to be the one. And so this idea that it can kind of cascade, that one neighbor's not paying and then the others say, well, then I'm not going to pay either. And so I think you're right that there's more work to do on what kind of messaging is effective. I think this one was actually, in my read of it, there's more that we can do. There's one project in Pretoria that did some messaging around non-payment that I know of, and so I'm happy to share that one with you. There's another project that I know of in India that was looking at how do you sort of build the relationship between the customer and the utility. I think there's a lot of interest in this because this is this giant problem of non-bill payment. And so one thing I will say here, though, is that if households truly could not pay, we might not expect to see this large increase in bill payment unless people are finding very costly ways of financing it, right? So taking out loans, not paying rent, other things like that. It is hard to know without more insight into what's actually happening with these households. So what this Spink paper did to help get at this just a little bit is she took advantage of the fact that this was in Livingstone, Zambia, that zoning meant that some households are sort of like low income just by the neighborhood and some are higher income just by the neighborhood. And she just looked at heterogeneous treatment effects from an increase in enforcement actions. So this water utility started to disconnect much more. And she looked at, if you're in a low income area, on average, how did you respond versus if you're in a high income area, on average, how did you respond, to try to start to tease this out a little bit and understand how are different types of households able to respond to enforcement actions, and does it mean that we need to be a little bit careful and try to target a little bit better? And that is exactly what she finds. So these lower income households, when they get hit with this increase in enforcement actions, what do? Well, they get disconnected, right? What is an enforcement action? It's if you're not paying your bill, we're going to disconnect you. And in fact, that is what happens. Not universally, but with a higher probability in these lower income areas. And they don't manage to pay off their bills. And so from the utilities perspective, this is also less helpful, right? This is a lower return action because these households probably, first of all, have fewer debts to begin with because they're poorer, they don't have as many appliances, et cetera. They're probably not using as much water. And then second, if they don't pay off their debts, then the utility does this costly enforcement action and these households just become non-customers, right? So at least they're not accruing more debts. We can worry about, welfare as well. Presumably that's a problem. But contrast that with these richer households. They respond to this increase in enforcement probabilities by paying down their debts. So they're not getting disconnected. This is a much higher return strategy for the water utility, and it actually allows them to recoup more of their revenue and do better, right? So this suggests that some targeting is potentially important, that the same type of intervention to try to improve bill payment is not going to work the same for all customers, and trying to figure out which ones are actually going to be effective becomes very important. Okay, good. So I want to talk for a few more minutes about sort of the other big thing that we see in this setting, which are subsidies. This can be subsidies showing up in a number of different ways. And I want to talk about that, and then I want to have a little bit of time to go through this case study from Cape Town. Okay, so I think we've set the stage a little bit to say that quality of service delivery can be variable, but also access. So we've been talking about quality conditional on having water supply. There are also many people in urban settings who just don't have water supply to begin with. All of these kinds of issues create these externalities on other users. So trying to increase connections, these fixed costs, these infrastructure costs, they have to be recovered somehow, whether it's through tariffs, whether it's through other financing sources. And we've been talking about why is it that people are not paying? Is it this inability to pay, or is it just taking advantage of lax enforcement? A common solution to trying to deal with inability to pay is some kind of subsidy. It also is just something that we see out there in urban service delivery across the board, regardless of concerns about willingness to pay, or ability to pay, sorry. And these subsidies, in some ways you can think of them as acting not so differently from somebody not paying their bill. It means that what the utility is getting back per unit of service supplied is less, depending of course on exactly how the subsidy is being applied. Subsidies are incredibly common. This is from this World Bank report that inventoried electricity and water subsidies around the world. I think it's something like 60% of countries have electricity subsidies in the residential sector, and an even larger share for water subsidies in the residential sector. So these are just incredibly widespread. They introduce distortions, right? They make it seem like these services are cheaper than they actually are. That's going to increase consumption. And a lot of times, and you can see this a little bit, we're not going to go through this table in great detail, but a lot of times these are not very well targeted. These are sort of generic subsidies. You can think of not enforcing people's bill payment as a form of a subsidy, right? You're subsidizing people not fully paying by not fully enforcing. Okay, so this has given rise to a few different types of issues. There's this very nice paper. This is actually now thinking about electricity by Sean McRae, looking at electricity quality in urban Colombia. And the point that he is making in this paper is just that when the utility is thinking about this question of where do I invest in improving service quality, I'm going to invest in the places where the returns to that investment are high. And those are places without subsidies. Those are places where people actually pay their bills. And so what he finds is that when the government goes in to a low-income neighborhood and starts to subsidize electricity for those households, it means that per kilowatt hour, the utility is getting less back from these lower-income neighborhoods. This means they start to invest less in infrastructure in these lower-income neighborhoods. People don't like it because electricity quality starts to fall. They pay their bills less, and you get into this negative spiral that is triggered by these subsidies to begin with, okay? So you're getting this setting where low subsidies beget low infrastructure quality, which begets low bill payment and lower investment, and it just deteriorates from there. Not to say this is always going to happen with subsidies. It depends, of course, on exactly how they're being applied. But there is this kind of risk of this the subsidy trap emerging. I'm just going to make a few kind of points here about subsidies. The second is that, so in South Africa, I know there's a lifeline tariff for electricity. Water, historically, and this depends a little bit at this point on where you are, has a free block associated with it. In your settings, how many of you are in a setting with a lifeline tariff for either water or electricity? Lifeline meaning that the first units you consume are free. Do you know, first of all? Yeah, you have? Others? Some? Okay. So this can be applied in two different ways. So who knows much about their water and electricity tariffs? Anybody? No? It is remarkable how hard it is to understand many of these tariffs. Even, PhD economists often are quite confused about how much your water or electricity actually costs. And some of this is precisely because of the fact that prices are nonlinear. What does that mean? What is a nonlinear tariff?
A tariff that can change.
A tariff that can change based on consumption. Good. So what it typically means is that in the context of water and electricity, that if your water's billed monthly, for example, the first few units that you consume in the month are priced at a lower price than the later units you consume in the month, not because of timing, but just because you're working your way up your consumption level is going up, you're working your way up this nonlinear tariff. Now, many of you raised your hand before when I asked if you had prepaid electricity meters. Interestingly, around the world, prepaid electricity meters often have nonlinear tariffs behind them. And what that means for a household that buys more than once in a month is that it is actually true that the first few units that you buy are cheaper than the last units that you buy. But again, it's not because of early in the month versus later in the month. It's just because these nonlinear prices are being charged based on how much you have purchased so far that month, which creates just like tremendous amounts of confusion about exactly how these tariffs are working. Okay, so putting consumer information aside for a moment and just thinking about sort of the pricing implications of this. So this lifeline tariff, what is the goal of it? Why do you think so many utilities have increasing block tariffs or have a lifeline tariff in place? Any ideas?
For low-income households who don't contribute as much.
Yeah, so you said the assumption right there. What is the key assumption?
They use less.
Yeah, so the key assumption for these nonlinear tariffs to be redistributive, right? For them to be pro-poor, for them to be helping these affordability concerns, right? We talked a minute ago about, are people not paying their bills because they can't afford the water, because they can't afford the electricity? Well, one way to potentially deal with that is to target subsidies to the people who can't afford it. If low-income households use less water and electricity, then a nonlinear tariff might do it. What do you think? Do you think that nonlinear tariffs are do you think that this assumption, let me put it that way, do you think this assumption is a good one? What would be some challenges to this assumption? Yeah. In what way?
So number of people in the household creates something different to your assumption.
Good. Okay, so how is water and electricity billed? It's billed at the household level, not at the individual level. If it were billed at the individual level, this wouldn't be a concern. Of course, that's not feasible. And so you aggregate people in the household and apply a bill. If there are more people in that household and household size is correlated with income in ways that go in the opposite direction, this could exactly offset this goal of redistributing based on consumption. What are some other concerns?
As has been mentioned, in Cape Town at least, and other parts of South Africa, wealthier people have moved off grid, so they're sort of using less municipal water.
Good. Yeah, so it may be, and this is going to be true with both water and electricity, right? So if you have rooftop solar, you don't use as much electricity, so maybe you are getting more of it on this cheaper block. If you have a borehole, you're not using as much grid water, right? So maybe you're getting more of it off of this lower block. So a bunch of different reasons why we might think that higher income households have access to these substitutes, lowering their use of the municipal service. Anything else? So a variant on the large households thing is if you have multiple households, multiple families living within a home, sharing a water meter, sharing an electricity meter. This is extremely true in a lot of settings. I know in a lot of cities in Ghana, this is true, that you have multiple households with one meter, and therefore it's gonna look like electricity use is really high, when in fact, per capita, it's very low. Okay, good. And so when people have analyzed this, they have found that in fact, these nonlinear tariffs are not great at redistributing from rich to poor. They're redistributing from high consumption to low consumption, but whether that achieves the rich to poor goal, not always clear. Okay, so let me spend the last just like 5 minutes or so going over this case study that brings up a lot of the themes that we've been talking about. This is looking at what happened here during day zero. And so this is really trying to think about service delivery in a setting where increasingly climate shocks are making it difficult. This is true in electricity, this is true in water, this is true in a lot of the services that we've been talking about. Makes it very difficult to meet these kind of consumption needs. All right, so, you know, like a lot of cities, the other challenge that we haven't been, well, we've been sort of hinting at but not talking about directly, is just the fact that there's a lot of inequality. And so the service delivery challenge is how do you serve both of these types of consumers in a way that is fair and equitable and reliable and efficient. Okay, I'm not going to have time to go through all of this in a lot of detail, but I do want to highlight a few things that kind of pull together the themes that we've been talking about. The paper's available if you're interested. But one of the challenges that climate change is going to bring forward is that when the individuals that are being affected by climate shocks, things like droughts or heat waves or other things like that, to the extent that we're interested in adaptation mattering for these types of urban services, it's not really the household that's going to be adapting directly to the climate shock, it's the utility that's going to have to adapt. And then the way in which the utility adapts is going to affect how the household can respond. And so we try to use this day zero case study to really kind of think that through. So try to understand how did the utility respond, and then how did that shape how households responded to this historical drought. Okay, how many of you have heard of the day zero drought in Cape Town? Yes. Okay, so in a few pictures. So Cape Town is very dependent on surface water for its water supply. That is becoming less true since day zero, but 98% of water supply in Cape Town prior to the drought was from these 6 large dams around the city. In normal days, this is what the largest of those dams looked like. At the peak of the crisis, this is what it looked like. So day zero refers to the date when these dam levels drop below 13.5% and it is no longer viable to get water. This one got to 11%. You cannot get water out of this dam. Right? And so at some point, there is just nothing you can do, right? You shut off the water supply. There's nothing you can do. And so this case was like the countdown to the point where there was just no water anymore. This was very prominent. It was all over the media. Spoiler alert, it didn't happen. And so the question that we're interested in this paper is what did the city do to reduce demand? And then what are the long-run consequences of this, okay? And so very kind of briefly, let me not kind of talk through all the details. I'll just show you some pictures and then we'll wrap up with that. But the point is basically we're going to focus in this. There were lots of things that happened. So many, many, many different things. We're going to focus on the piece that we can see in the data, which are prices. So prices went up a lot during the drought. So you can see this in this figure. This is this nonlinear tariff. This is the tariff schedule for the kind of non-poor, both before and after the drought. These are the prices at the peak of the drought. So they went way, way, way up. Again, lots of other things happening too, but this is what we can see in the data. So what happened to consumption? We use the city's administrative water billing data to try to trace out this story. You can see property values. The lightest color lines are the richest, measured by property value, decile in the city. The darkest lines is the poorest decile. These are all formal households. This is not including the informal areas. So these are not the poorest people in Cape Town, but the poorest formal decile. What you can see, this gray shaded area refers to as kind of this countdown to day zero. You see this massive contraction right? So leading up to the drought, the richest households are consuming over twice as much water per month as the poorest households. At the peak, look closely here, this pattern reverses. The richest households are actually using less municipal water than the poorest households, okay? This is a remarkable pattern, just looking at how much consumption was changing, especially at the top. Everybody reduced their usage, but these rich households, they just completely collapsed it, okay? And so what we want to understand in this paper is what happened. This substitution story that's been coming up, again, this is not the only thing going on, but this is the piece of it that we trace out in this paper. Several of you have brought up this idea of substitution to private alternatives to publicly provided water. The price of publicly provided water goes through the roof. What happens? People find ways around it. People find alternatives. And in this case, at least some of what happened was people sunk wells, right? So they went and found alternative ways of, typically not for drinking water, but for those gardens that I was showing you before, finding ways to have alternatives. Gray water systems, the gray water systems are not showing up here, but using it for wastewater, using it for other things. Again, the richest households are the ones that are drilling boreholes. So these are borehole license applications, again, by decile. We also want to see, how else can we see this? There's more in the paper. We look at greenness of the parcels using satellite data. We collect groundwater table depths by neighborhood, so looking at the richer versus poorer neighborhoods. And what you can see here is that in these richer areas, groundwater tables actually fall much more than in the poorer areas, even though everybody's drawing out of the same aquifer, consistent with a big shift toward groundwater use in these richer areas. Cape Town responded from a policy perspective in ways that really tried to protect and to help households in a lot of ways. So the first concern is that, well, you saw that giant contraction in water use among the rich. That's going to play out in terms of tariffs in all the ways that we've just been talking about, right? So the revenue that's coming in as consumption plummets is going to fall. We in fact see that. But then what this also does is have this redistributive effect. So I showed you this is an increasing block tariff. If previously the rich households were consuming at that highest block, and now they're consuming on a much lower block, that's going to mean that more of the costs are being borne by the lower income households. Okay, so what did the city do to avoid this? They did two main things. One, they did introduce fixed charges. They're still trying to increase those fixed charges, but they did introduce fixed charges, which actually went a long way. It made up this revenue gap that they were otherwise facing because of the decline in consumption. They also protected the lowest income households from this, so they didn't charge the fixed charge to the lowest income households, and they expanded the amount, this free part of the tariff to those lowest income households. And so what that did was that mitigated this cost shift from the rich to the poor. It protected the poor a little bit from that cost shift. Okay, so the result was that post-drought revenue stabilized. I'm getting the signal that we're out of time. And this is just in figures, this kind of equalization of revenue. This is going to be a problem that we're going to continue to see. And so all the lessons that we talked about kind of in the first part of the lecture of thinking about prices, thinking about payment, thinking about all of these different pieces, this is going to really, in the water utility space, going to be something that is increasingly problematic as you add this climate shock, unreliable supply piece on top of all of those difficulties. So again, sorry for using all of our time. Thank you for the interaction as we went along. And the paper is available if you're interested to see more.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Jack.